Boston Irish Wars poured into 1966 like nobody's business. The FBI saw this and they looked at the bigger picture. There was complete chaos in the streets of Boston. It seemed as though no one was in charge of the underworld. Patriarca was still running a tight ship, but the FBI saw an opportunity. They started to squeeze his organization from the top. So he's got madness on the street, FBI squeezing him with the Justice Department and the state police. They're putting the pressure on him. The idea was eventually he'd make a mistake. He'd slip up. And when he did, he'd take his organization with him to jail. So the Bureau began to spread rumors across the United States with the other mob families that, maybe Patriarca's losing control over New England. Maybe these guys who are out shooting up the streets were really in charge. Oddly enough, in the long run, one of those shooters took over the Patriarch organization. So it was sort of true, although they were just making it up to put it on him. In July of that year, Patriarch wanted to make sure the underworld understood he was still in charge. He was the authority. And he ordered the needless execution of a guy named Willie Marfeo, who was a Providence bookie, obnoxious Providence, but was still the same. Uh, in January 1966, Joe Barboza was arrested. He punched a cop. They got him for illegal possession of a firearm, possession of marijuana, disturbing the police, plus hitting the cop. So he brought in a young Baily out of Hartford, who managed to have him put all the charges put off except the least serious one, disturbing the peace. In March of '66, Jimmy Fleming got sent to prison for 4 to 6 years for armed robbery with intent to murder. So that left a big hole on the streets. Also in March of 1966, Connie and Stephen Hughes, the brothers, drove to Connie's house out in Malden, where they were ambushed probably by Joe Barboza and Joe Chico Miko, his constant hanger-on. A lot of other people say it was Wimpy Bennett. Even Stevie Hughes didn't know for sure who it was. Hughes was wounded in this. Stevie Hughes was wounded. He had to go to the hospital for a month, and eventually his spleen was removed. His brother Connie escaped, but barely. When the cops showed up, they said, "What happened?" He said, "Why, you fucking stupid? He got shot." And then he walked away. Tony Varanis and David Sulakis. They were both from Dorchester. They had records. They were out drinking at a bar, and they weren't seen again until they turned up dead one day away from each other, April 25 and April 26. Varanis was an ex-boxer who left the ring in 1958 after he had a match with Joe Devlin. He probably had brain damage before he went into the fight, but Devlin delivered a terrible beating. It was a real barn burner, that fight. He left after that. He had serious brain injuries. Sidlakis, who was with the Warehousemen's Union, was shot in the head 3 times with a stolen Army .45. A man digging for clams found the pistol, and the police figured, well, the body must be nearby. They found it the next day at the bottom of a deep embankment off a highway. Police determined that Varanis had been on his knees when they shot him. He was badly beaten around the head and the neck, maybe after he was killed. Ronald Jackman, another Dorchester guy, was indicted for the murders, but he was released from the charge. The actual killer was more than probably Johnny Matarano. The story was that in April of that year, Varanis was out drinking. He comes across Matarano. Words are spoken. Varanis reaches for his gun in a waistband, but Matarano draws faster and shoots first, and he kills Varanis with one bullet. And then he drove the boxer's corpse out of town to Milton and dumped him over there. On May 25, 1966, the McLeans, they got word that Connie Hughes was inside a Charleston bar. He was in a sour mood. He's looking for the guy that ambushed his brother. Joe Barboza probably got together a hit squad of 2 cars and waited outside. The reason he was able to do that is inside the bar, an up-and-coming hood, Brian Halloran, was in the bar, and he managed to get word out that Connie Hughes was there and he'd be leaving shortly. By the way, Connie Hughes beat that young guy, I don't have his name, whoever it was, for 1 hour, and he stabbed him in the legs with a fairly long knife. So a little past midnight, he's had enough. Hughes gets in his car. He drives away towards the Mystic River Bridge, and there's a toll booth there. And the Barboza guys follow him. Just past the toll booth, 2 cars, Barboza's probably in one, they come zipping up alongside Connie Hughes' car. They fire 60 shots. Remarkably, only 2 bullets hit Hughes, but they hit him in the head and they killed him. And that's a big blow to the organization. On June 15th, 1966, Rocco Di Siglio was murdered. He'd been a professional welterweight as well. Uh, he was associated with the Patriarca family in armed robberies and gambling while he was in the ring. In 1964, he left the ring and he started to do holdups of high-stake card games, dice games. And he did it mostly in Newton and Lowell, upper-income areas, but those games were protected by the Angulo brothers out of Boston, and they knew who was robbing their games because DeSiglio and the others didn't bother to wear masks. They just walked in and robbed the people. Joe Barboza was later told the FBI. He later told the FBI that the Angulos had told two men who they had working under them and had been robbing the games with DeSiglio, Bernard Zena and Richard DeVincent, that they gave him a choice. We know you're working with this guy. We know you're robbing our games, even though you're on our payroll. So you either murder him or we murder you. It's your choice. So that was an easy one. A week later, Zena and DeVincent left the bar with DeSiglio, telling him they planned to pick up a stolen car for a robbery they had planned. They drove out to a dark street and they executed DeSiglio at close range, 3 shots to the head. DeVincent fired the shots. They drove to Topsfield, the town, and dumped the body in the Ipswich River in the wild sanctuary just outside Danvers, Mass. DeVincent would later be murdered by unknown members of the Patriarca mob in Medford, Massachusetts on April 3rd, 1966. On July 13, 1966, Willie Marfeo, this is the fellow we discussed earlier, was a Providence bookie, kind of a loudmouth, and he decided that he would take advantage of all this warfare going on in New England. He'd strike out on his own. And he started to operate gambling operations on Federal Hill in Providence, which was, when I was a boy, was the Italian neighborhood, but was where Patriarca's office was. But Marfeo, he's 46 years old. He's got an arrest record that goes back to 1940. He just doesn't seem to give a damn. Patriarca didn't want it to be a regional hit because it could be brought back to him. He calls up this gangster, Joe Paterno, in New Jersey, who sends up a killer to take care of Marfeo. He sends up Butch Misselli and members of his gang out of northern New Jersey. Marfeo's shot. He's eating pizza at the corner kitchen restaurant in Providence, and there's a single gunman walks in, tells him, get into a phone booth over there, shoots him dead. There is a video on that here on this site. You can look for it. On July 24, Barboza, he's 33 now, Nick Femme, Joey Miko, they get into a fight at a night spot in Revere with this guy, Arthur Pearson. He was a doorman at the place. This fight was just part of his ongoing problem between Barboza, his crew, and this guy Pearson. As Pearson and his girlfriend walked towards the car, or a girl, I don't know if it was his girlfriend, walked to a car later on near the beach, Barboza and the other two are waiting for him, and they've got knives. They're waiting out with their knives out. So, and they say, we don't like you, guy. And someone comes up from behind him and stabs the guy. So he was rushed from the hospital. Amico was probably the one who stabbed him. He's rushed to the hospital, and police arrest Barboza and the others because the girl talked. However, Pearson refused to answer even one question in court. He claimed protection of the Constitution by declining to answer questions that may harm him. It's kind of a stretch of what that law was intended to be, but whatever. By the end of the summer, the judge eventually jailed him for refusing to testify. But anyway, once again, Barboza and his guys walk away untouched. By the end of the summer, Stevie Hughes was running the badly beaten up McLaughlin gang, and he's thinking about suing for peace. He was badly outnumbered, badly outspent. He knew he wasn't going to win this war, so he reached out to Winter Hill mob. He began discussions about ending the war. But before he could do anything, before anything could be arranged, Barboza and Chico Miko found out that Hughes and a loan shark, a bad loan shark named Sammy Lindenbaum, were headed over to Lawrence, Massachusetts to work in the gambling numbers games over there, lottery games over there. 2 miles outside the town of Middleton, a black sedan suddenly appears out of the side of the car Hughes is driving. A gun barrel points out the backseat of the window. It's Frank Salmi. He fires, he hits Lindenbaum in the hand. Lindenbaum loses control of the car and he heads towards an embankment. Stevie Hughes reached for his gun, but he was cut down in a hail of bullets. The car slid down an embankment and into a swamp. Hughes and Lindenbaum were both dead. However, just a weird point was Lindenbaum had these two little dogs with him, two miniature dogs, and they leaped into the back seat when the gunfire started, and they hid under the chairs. And remarkably, they lived through the shootings and the car crashing and so forth. Johnny Jackson, he was a bartender, was gunned down on September 28 as he parked his car in a poorly lit area behind a row of apartments at around 3 in the morning on September 28th. The killer shot him 5 times in the lower back and twice in the head. He used a shotgun and a pistol. Jackson was the late-hour bartender at a downtown restaurant, Luigi's, in the South End. In 1964, he was working the night shift when the body of a waitress, Margaret Sylvester, this gorgeous blue-eyed blonde, was found in a loft over the restaurant by police. He hadn't done it. He hadn't had anything to do with it. He was unlucky enough to be there when she was murdered. She'd been stabbed 3 times in the abdomen and then wrapped in a rug. And someone called the police and told them that stolen furs could be found in the apartment above the restaurant. And that's where Sylvester was, of course. She'd only been dead a short while after the police arrived. The day before she was murdered, Sylvester was in Luigi's restaurant. She was a waitress. According to witness, was in, quote, in a loud and argumentative mood with Jimmy Martirano, the brother of Johnny Martirano. She was probably drunk and was leaning on Martirano, and at one point fell off the bar stool. Martirano told her to go home. She did, but she came back the next night and resumed the argument, drunk again, with Martirano, who may have been with his brother at the time, maybe. Anyway, John Martirano was known to carry a knife, and he could use a knife. He more than probably used a knife on a guy named Jack Bano in the 1969 murder. Police figured that the brothers stabbed the girl, carried her 3 flights up this narrow set of stairs, because getting her out to the car to dump her someplace else was going to be a problem. There were onlookers. Martirano admitted to murdering 20 people, but he said Jimmy the Bear Fleming murdered the girl, murdered Sylvester. But who knows? On the one way or the other, there were 2 witnesses to this cold-blooded killing, Bobby Palladino and Johnny Jackson. They couldn't have him, Jackson being the bartender. They just couldn't let him go like that. So what they do is Bobby Palladino was a former convict, an armed robber. He was a friend of John Maturino's in 1962. Wimpy Bennett and Steve Fleming told Maturino that Palladino was bad-mouthing him all over about this murder, about murdering this waitress, how they didn't have to do it. It was cold-blooded, blah, blah, blah. So John Maturino said this. So I have to believe that when Stevie Fleming was telling me I had to kill this guy, Palladino, to protect my family. The reality was I was killing to protect his family, his brother, Jimmy the Bear, whom Martirano insisted did the actual killing of the waitress. John Martirano collected Bobby Palladino from the street. He drove by and said, hey, come on, get in the car. He did. At that point, Martirano got in the back seat. The car was being driven by someone else. Martirano got in the back seat, which you would think Palladino would wise up to that, but he didn't. And when he did, he fired a single bullet through Palladino's head. He killed him, and he dropped the body. Barboza is riding high at this point. He's got a lot of growing power, but he's out of control. He's reckless. He's power mad. He won't pay attention to the rules. The Patriarca people are beginning to warm up to him that maybe they could find a place for him, which is all he wanted. He wanted to be a made guy very badly. But the problem is he doesn't understand the rules, and he won't abide by the rules. I'll give you an example. He walked into a place that was under mob protection, and he said, well, congratulations, you're paying me now, not them. So it was that sort of behavior. And the fact is he was so splashy. He was a loudmouth. His murders, the cops knew about, brought in a lot of attention. So by mid-1966, the Justice Department is looking at him. The FBI is following this guy. Massachusetts State Police want a piece of him. Boston State Police Department, they all want this guy. And that weakens his position with the Patriarca family. They're just thinking, this guy got to go. He's a problem. You can always find a murderer. He could be replaced. So the cops knew this much about Barboza, that in 1964 until 66 at least, he laundered money from outside New England. They knew he drew two salaries. One was from the insurance company called Shawmut in Boston, where he was on the books as a salesman, and the Blue Bunny Lounge and Duffy's Lounge also paid him as a PR consultant. In 1966, October 6, 1966, Barboza, Nick Femia, Patrick Fabiano, Trash Brastos, they're driving through the combat zone. A slew of cop cars pull them over. They search the car. They knew exactly where to look. They find an illegal and unregistered Army M1 rifle, a loaded .45 caliber pistol, and a knife. So at the time, Barboza and Femia were out on bail in connection with a stabbing, and they think the knife is connected to that. Because of pending court action and a new charge of illegal possession of firearms, the judge, who's well aware of who Barboza is and wants him off the street as much as the cop do, sets the bail at $100,000. Barboza's sitting there thinking, well, that's all right. Patriarca's lawyers will show up any minute now and bail me out, but they didn't. Then later on, he learns that Patriarca's guys more than probably set the whole thing up. They sent him on a mission into Boston, into the combat zone, and told the cops what color car he'd be driving, where he was, and so forth. So they slam him away in jail. That leaves Brastos and DePrisco, a friend of his, well, two of his guys, to try to raise the cash to get him out of jail. So there's two versions of what happened. One is that on November 15th, everyone agrees on that, Brastos, who's a loan shark, and DePrisco, who is his enforcer, walked into the nightclub lounge, North End Club, and demanded a share of the club's take. That part is doubtful. That it probably isn't what happened. Because the place was owned by Ralphie Chong La Matina, who was part of the Zanino crew. La Matina was a powerful guy. He ran narcotics for the Patriarca organization. He's protected. He was also a leading suspect in the loud and splashy 1950 murder of George Killeen. DePrisco apparently says, you're going to pay us. He says, no. So DePrisco, according to the story, leans over and slaps La Matina in the face because he was laughing about being shaken down. Brastos and DePrisco were lured back to the bar, the nightlife cafe, and then murdered. Their bullet-ridden bodies were found in Brastos' Cadillac, parked on a street corner in South Boston. An informant later told the cops that they plopped the bodies down there in South Boston because they were hoping it would mislead the cops into thinking this had been an Irish problem and not with the mafia. The same informant told the police that the killers had robbed both of the men, Brastos and DePrisco, of about $35,000 of bail money that they had raised for Barboza's release. Oh, and both of the bodies found in the Cadillac, Brastos and DePrisco, had been badly battered. The faces were swollen from being kicked. Another version of this, probably the right version, was that Brastos and DePrisco were told to come to the nightlight to meet Larry Bione, who would give them money for Barboza's bail. As a good faith measure, they said, bring what you got here. Everyone will kick in, and we'll make sure we have enough the $100,000 to get him out on bail. Stupidly, they bought into that. Brastos, DePrisco, Chico, Miko, and Patsy Fabiano, they walk into the club, which is closed, and they find at least 12 of Patriarca's guys, including the boss, Larry Zananino, waiting for them. The others were Ralphie Chong, John Sinacata, Ralph Wagenheimer, and Bione, of course, along with the bartender, Joe Lanza. Lanza turned out was an FBI informant, rather. So Brastos and DePrisco are the first to step in. They're shot dead immediately. Amico and Fabiano run like hell and they escape. An informant said later, look, to put it simply, they were rocking the boat and they just fell overboard in the process. So, to close out the year, Joey Amico was murdered on December 8th. That night, Amico and Jimmy Kearns, who was bad news, he was a South End bartender, were in the infamous combat zone. They were into a bar there. They were scheduled to meet somebody. It's common knowledge on the street that Amico and 5 other hoods were on a hit list by the mafia that the police had given a copy of the list, and they knew about it as of December 1. The others on the list were probably Barboza, Nick Femi, Patrick Fabiano. Boston police had Amico and Kearns under surveillance early in the night, but then they gave up on the surveillance, let him wander. They go to this bar in the combat zone, and there's a guy, Frizzy. Frizzy and his brother Connie, they were East Boston hoods, were originally Barboza's partners. There was a falling out. Everyone had a falling out with Barboza. And Barboza and Brastos bought him out. Brastos is now dead, of course. Amico was overheard talking to Fritzy. He says, as a plea, he says, Fritzy, please straighten it out. This is my life. You've got to straighten this out. Fritzy told him that they would go to a Revere night spot, a nightclub out there, and all of the problems they had would be cleared up. Somebody was out there going to meet him, and they'd be given money because these guys were starving. They had no income now that Barboza had been in jail. Kearns is suspicious because Fritzy, he says, displayed a, quote, unusual nervousness. Among other things, Fritzy drank 6 scotches during this very brief meeting that they had. So Kearns leans into him, grabs him, and says, this better not be a setup. And when he wouldn't answer him, he punched him in the face. The 2 guys, Kearns and Amico, they leave the bar in the combat zone. Around 12:40, they drove out to Alphonse's Broken Heart Club, a second-floor lounge near the corner of Tremont and Stewart Streets in Revere. About an hour later, when Kearns drove away from the Revere night spot with Amico on the passenger side, another car pulls out of the parking lot where they were and pursues them. A second car comes up. There's a blaze of gunfire from the pursuing cars, armor-piercing rifle bullets that riddled the Kearns rented car. The car smashed down a telephone pole before it came to a halt. Amico's dead. A bullet in the back of the head pushed out his eye. Kearns had superficial wounds, but he was fine, remarkably. Police found that D'Amico really was broke. He had, Amico was really broke. He had $16 in his pocket, and that's it. The Barboza gang, what had been the gang, was this informal gang, was eventually gradually killed off because they were feared. They were feared by the gangsters. Nick Femi, Patsy Fabiano, Jimmy Kearns, they lived past the Irish Wars, remarkably, although Fabiano, I'm told for the most part, was looked as a non-combatant, and they left him alone.